The observatory was not supposed to be occupied. Brennan had checked the palace scheduling log twice before climbing the East Wing stairs, twice, because he had learned in his first 3 weeks at the Velnara court that the difference between a logged appointment and an actual occupant was often a matter of convention he hadn't read yet. The scheduling conventions at this court were not arbitrary exactly, but they were layered. There were formal logs and shadow logs and unwritten understandings about which spaces belonged to whom in what way, and a Terran attaché who read only the official system was reading approximately 70% of the available information. He had spent his first 3 weeks identifying the other 30%, and his next 5 months learning how to use it without making it obvious that he was using it. The log said the upper observatory was unscheduled between the 3rd and 4th hours of the evening watch. The log, as it turned out, was technically correct. The Queen was not there on a schedule. She was there because she wanted to be, and wanting to be was not a thing you logged. He understood that a half-second too late, after he had already stepped through the wide archway into the chamber, after his eyes had already adjusted to the low amber light filtering in through the vast curved viewing dome above, after he had already seen her standing at the outer rail with her hands loose at her sides, and her face turned upward toward the star field. She was still in her session robes, the deep indigo formal layer she wore to evening council, though the outer ceremonial wrap had been removed and set somewhere he couldn't see. And she looked, from the archway, less like the queen of the Velnara court and more like a person who had needed to stand somewhere quiet and had found the right place. And then she turned her head at the sound of his boots on the pale stone floor, and the moment of her as person resolved back into her as queen with the particular precision she applied to that transition, and he stopped. She did not move. "Attaché Kale," Queen Asara Veldreth said. Her voice in the observatory was different than it was in the council chamber, lower, less shaped for a room, less calibrated for the specific acoustics of a space designed to carry authority to 20 listeners simultaneously. The observatory was not designed for authority. It was designed for looking. "You seem surprised to find this level occupied." "I apologize, Your Grace." He had his portfolio under one arm and his data tablet in his hand and nowhere to put either of them that would not look like an attempt to seem casual. He kept them where they were. "The log showed this level clear. I was going to use the dome for reference work. I have star chart cross-referencing that's easier with the physical dome than with the flat atlas." He paused. "I'll use the South Gallery instead. There's a terminal there that reads the same charts." "There is," she said. She had not moved from the rail. She was still half-turned toward him, and the low amber light caught the edge of her jaw and the pale silver of her hair worn up this evening, pinned with the carved pale stone comb she used for formal sessions, and the green gold of her eyes was doing something particular that he had spent the past 3 months at this court learning to identify and still could not entirely read. It was not the assessment look. It was not the judgment look. It was something quieter than those, less directed. "You could also stay." What? He was careful with the pause, long enough to register the offer properly. Short enough not to make it a problem or to make her feel that it had been registered as a problem, which were different things but both required the same response. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your—" He stopped himself before he said *privacy*, because Velnara queens did not have a word that mapped cleanly to privacy in the way Terrans used it. The closest equivalent referred to a deliberate structural absence, a chosen unwitnessed state, and using it casually implied he was labeling what she was doing without her having labeled it herself. "On your time here," he finished. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, it was more precise than that, an acknowledgement of the navigated syntax. "You may stay," she said. "I find I do not mind the company this evening." Brennan Kale had been the junior cultural attaché to the Terran embassy's Velnara posting for 6 months and 11 days, which meant he had spent 6 months and 11 days being precisely, carefully, determinedly useful in ways that did not draw attention to himself. This was not timidity. He had made a study of the Velnara court from the moment Ambassador Dren had told him the posting was his, and what he had learned before he set foot in the palace was that the Velnara court rewarded competence and found self-promotion aesthetically displeasing. Competence was demonstrated through outputs. Visibility was for people whose outputs were insufficient to demonstrate it any other way. He had, accordingly, produced good outputs and remained quiet. He spoke Velnara at functional level, not perfectly, but without the blunt truncations that marked a learner who had only worked from grammars and not from actual conversation. The tonal distinctions were the difficult part. Velnara was a pitch-sensitive language, and a Terran speaker who got the content right, but the tones wrong was saying a grammatically coherent thing that felt, to a native listener, slightly wrong at the edges. He had worked on the tones in his first 3 months until a council clerk had corrected him twice, and then stopped correcting him, which he had taken as evidence of progress. He had memorized the succession line, the House alliances, the 17 treaty provisions currently in quiet dispute, and the scheduling conventions that the Terran embassy had gotten wrong for the first 2 years of the posting. Not through malice, but through the reasonable assumption that a palace's official log was its actual log, rather than one layer of a more complex system. He had corrected this assumption early and quietly, and it had improved the embassy's standing in approximately 4 ways that he had documented internally, and had not yet needed to explain to anyone. He had learned which council members responded to written briefings, and which retained information better through spoken summary. He had learned that Councillor Velteth, the Queen's senior aide, preferred directness and found excessive courtesy inefficient, a preference she expressed through very slight changes in the spacing of her responses, a Velnara social signal that he had taken 6 weeks to identify. He had learned that Lord Orath Vel, whose approval was required for any trade provision adjustment, interpreted directness as presumption unless it was preceded by the appropriate deference framework, and that getting the deference framing slightly wrong cost approximately 3 sessions of recovery time. He had not gotten it wrong in the last 4 months. And he had learned the Queen from a distance, the way you learn anything important, by watching what she did when she was not performing and filing it carefully and not deciding what to make of it yet. In the council chamber, Queen Asara Veldreth was precise, economical, and entirely unreadable. She asked questions that seemed mild and landed like surgical instruments, questions that appeared to be requesting clarification, but were, if you followed the implication chain, restructuring the entire basis of the position being clarified. She gave no ground and did not appear to need any. She acknowledged competence when she encountered it briefly, without excess. The court moved around her the way a current moves around a fixed point, accommodating and adjusting, never quite reaching the center. In the places between performance, the transition moments between formal sessions, the brief corridor minutes before the official arrival in a room, she was something slightly different. Still precise, still largely unreadable. But there was something in the stillness of those transition moments, a quality of the 15 seconds when she was not yet the Queen and not yet not the Queen, that he had been filing away carefully without deciding what to make of it yet. He crossed the observatory floor now and took a position at the rail a careful distance to her left. He set his portfolio on the low bench along the curve of the dome and looked up. The star field through the Velnara Observatory dome was not the same sky he had grown up with. The star positions were different here, the constellations unfamiliar, the overall density of visible stars lower in some quadrants and higher in others due to the planet's position in the arm. The compact's 5th primary transit relay glittered at the apex of the dome's viewing angle, a fixed point of blue-white industrial light among the older lights, the only thing in the dome he could have identified immediately, because it was manufactured rather than born. "Which one are you looking at?" he asked. It was a reasonable question, specific enough to be a real question and neutral enough not to be a claim. She was quiet for a moment, and he did not fill the quiet. At this court, filling quiet was a claim. It implied the previous speaker had finished and had nothing more to add, which was often wrong and was always presumptuous to assume. "The one at bearing 42, she said. 7th magnitude, no registered name in the compact atlas. It has a name in the old Velnara sky charts, the pre-compact navigational surveys. Velsath Thuren," she paused. "It means roughly the patient star." The old designation was navigational. It holds position against the drift pattern when the reference stars around it shift over long spans. Sailors used it as a fixed point before the relay infrastructure was built. "Does it still hold position?" "Yes," something in her voice shifted, not much, just enough. "Velsath Thuren is still exactly where it was when the charts were made. The infrastructure came and the relay lights were brighter, and the surveyors updated the compact atlas with the new reference system, but the star did not change because of that." He looked at bearing 42. He found it not difficult once he knew what to look for. It was, as she said, 7th magnitude, which meant it was not the brightest thing in its quadrant of sky and was not the first thing the eye went to. It was simply steady. "You come here often," he said. It was not quite a question. He had seen the observatory on the scheduling log before unscheduled, which he was now understanding meant asterisk unlogged asterisk, not asterisk empty. "Often enough," she said. "It is one of the few places in this palace where I am not required to be the queen." He heard that carefully. It was more than she typically said to anyone in the embassy's orbit, and she knew he was in the embassy's orbit, which meant she had said it to him knowing who he was and had decided it was something he could hear. He did not make anything of it aloud. He looked at Velsath Thuren and thought about what it meant that she had said it. "I can still use the South Gallery," he said. "I wasn't following you here." "I know you weren't." She turned from the dome then fully and looked at him. The green gold of her eyes in the amber light was direct in a way that was different from the council chamber, less shaped for effect, more like actually looking, the way you look at something you are genuinely trying to see. "If you had been trying to be here, I would have found it inconvenient. The fact that you were not is precisely why I said you could stay." He understood the distinction. The distinction mattered. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Isara," she said, "when we are not in a formal session or a context that requires the title is optional. It is a convention I apply selectively." She paused. "I am telling you this because I applied it selectively just now." He filed that with enormous care. "Isara," he said, and the name fit differently in his mouth than asterisk Your Grace. Not smaller exactly, but more real, like the difference between a map reference and an actual location. They stayed in the observatory for nearly 2 hours. He did, in fact, use his star charts. Not at first. But after the first half hour, when the silence between them had settled into something that did not require management, he had opened his portfolio and taken out the cross-reference document and worked through the positional mappings he had been trying to resolve for the past week. The Terran Navigational Reference System and the Velnara Old Chart System used different base points and different angular notations, and the standard translation guide the embassy used was good enough for treaty provision work, but not precise enough for the kind of cross-referencing he was doing. She had asked him at one point what he was mapping. He had explained the discrepancy, the base point mismatch, the angular notation difference, the 3 positions that wouldn't align correctly even after adjustment. She had looked at his document, read it for approximately 40 seconds, and then named 3 corrections. The first 2 were straightforward, different base point conversions than the standard guide used. The third was more complex, a rotational offset that the standard guide did not account for because it had been calibrated from a position 2 systems away from the Velnara primary, and the offset accumulated across the distance. "Where did you learn the old chart designations?" he asked after the 3rd correction. "My mother," she said, simply, without the particular weight people sometimes put on parental references, not performing the loss, just naming the source. She had a copy of the original Survey Atlas pre-compact, pre-relay system produced in the 4th century of the old calendar. She kept it in the family archive. She said it was useful to know where things were before the infrastructure arrived, because the infrastructure could be removed and the stars could not. "Practical," he said. She was practical. The present tense had shifted to past tense in a way that was so natural he almost missed it. She was queen for 31 years. 31 years requires a particular quality of pragmatism. A pause. She also found the old atlas beautiful, which she would not have said in those words, but which was true. She came to this observatory because of the atlas, when she needed to remember what things were underneath the infrastructure. He did not ask any further questions about her mother. He went back to his chart corrections and let her decide what else, if anything, she wanted to say. She did not say anything further about her mother. She did, however, stay for the remainder of the 2 hours, and when the 4th hour bell rang through the palace system, she straightened from the rail and told him the morning session would begin at the 2nd hour. "You will be in the gallery," she said. "4th chair, 2nd row," he said. "I've had the same seat for 4 months." "I know." And then she left through the archway, and he stood at the rail for another few minutes, looking at Velsath Thuren, and thought very carefully about what he was going to do with the evening. He decided to do nothing with it, which was the right answer, and went back to his chart corrections and finished them and filed them with the appropriate notations of attribution. The observatory was unscheduled 3 nights later. He went up with his portfolio for what were, technically, legitimate reasons. The trade provision charts were easier to cross-reference against the old star atlas when he had the actual dome above him and could correlate the angular coordinates directly. This was true. He did not examine the other reasons he might have for going to the observatory at the 3rd hour when the log showed it unscheduled. She was not there when he arrived. He set up his materials on the bench, took his position at the rail, and did his cross-referencing for an hour, which left his positions better mapped than they had been, and his chart document significantly improved. Then he sat at the rail and looked at Velsath Thuren, because it was a steady reference point, and he had formed the habit of locating it. She arrived 40 minutes after he did. He heard the footsteps in the corridor. She moved quietly, but the East Wing corridor had a particular acoustic quality at this level of the palace, and he had spent enough time in the building to know the difference between the sound of someone moving with intent and the sound of someone moving because they needed to go somewhere. He did not turn toward the archway. "Udashe Kale," she said. "Isara," he said, because she had extended the option and it would have been a small dishonesty to retreat from it. She crossed to the rail and took her position to his left, and neither of them said anything for a while. The silence settled as it had settled before, not requiring anything. He watched the stars. She watched the stars. Outside the dome, the relay light held its position at the apex of the viewing arc. "You came back," she said eventually. "I had more chart work." Yes, a pause, "So did you." He understood that she was not talking about the charts. He did not say so. He said, "The provision mapping is more straightforward with the dome for reference," which was true, and she said, "I imagine it is," and they watched the stars for another 20 minutes before he went back to his portfolio and she stayed at the rail. The observatory visits became a pattern over the following 5 weeks. Not every night, that would have been noticeable, and neither of them had any interest in producing a pattern that the court's lateral communication channels would have characterized before either of them had characterized it to themselves. But 3 or 4 times a week, one or the other of them would find the dome useful for something, and the other would happen to be there or would arrive not long after, and they would be at the rail together for an hour or 2 hours before the bell rang and the formal world reasserted itself through sound. The scheduling log remained empty of their names. The dome remained officially unscheduled. In those hours, he learned her the way he had been learning her for 6 months, by watching carefully and not announcing what he was doing. But the observatory was different from the gallery and the corridors, because in the observatory she was not managing the distance between the queen and the room. She was just there at the rail, talking the way people talk when they are not performing and have found someone they do not need to perform for. He learned that she had been queen for 7 years. That her mother had died in the 4th year of her own reign, when Isara was 19, and the succession had come earlier than anyone had prepared for, and that 19 years of preparation for a role was both a great deal of preparation and not enough for the thing itself. That the consort who had been selected for her, a match that had been in process for 2 years before her mother's death, had died 14 months after the bonding, which was long enough for the court to have considered it a completed bond, and short enough that the grief had been genuine rather than ceremonial. She did not tell him any of this directly. She told him pieces of it across 5 weeks, each piece arriving naturally in the flow of something else. The succession line had come up during a discussion of the trade provisions. She had mentioned a provision that related to a transit route that had been designated in the 3rd year of her mother's reign, and from there had mentioned the transition year, and from there a single sentence about the speed of the transition. The consort had come up when she mentioned the observatory's west-facing scope, which had been installed by her predecessor in the dome. Not that predecessor, the one before. Veldath was fond of the spectral array work. He spent a great deal of time in this room. She had said it cleanly, not avoiding it, not dwelling in it, naming it the way you name a real thing. He had said, the scope is still calibrated well. Whoever maintained it after him did good work. Because that was the honest and neutral thing to say, and because he could hear that she needed him to let her choose the weight of the reference herself, not have it chosen for her. She had said, I maintained it, and then she had gone back to the star field. He had thought about that for a long time after. The image of her 7 years ago, 19 years old and newly queen and recently bereaved, learning to service a spectral array scope, because the person who had known how to do it was gone, and she was not the kind of person who let something she cared about fall into disrepair through insufficient attention. The combination of grief and pragmatism in a single act. The way that was, he had concluded, a very precise summary of how she had spent the 7 years since. He had thought about it and done nothing with it, which was still the right answer. Across those 5 weeks, he also told her things, in the unannounced way that the observatory seemed to invite. He told her about the chart corrections she had given him in the first week, which he had incorporated into the official embassy survey atlas with a note of attribution. She said she had not expected attribution. He said that was the point of attribution. It went where it was due, not where it was expected. He told her about the treaty provision that had nearly been misread in the second month, because the standard translation guide used an archaic Velnara term whose meaning had shifted between the original drafting and the current usage. A misread that would have had significant implications for the mineral rights language if he hadn't caught it in the 4th review pass. She had said she had wondered if the embassy had noticed. He had said he had filed an internal note about the translation gap and had also recommended to Ambassador Dren that the guide be updated. She had said, after a pause, that the Compact's official translation resources had the same gap, and that she had noted it in a review 2 years ago and it had not been corrected. He had said he would reference the Compact gap in his recommendation to Dren, because a Compact-level issue made the embassy's gap look like a symptom of a wider problem rather than an oversight specific to the Terran mission. She had said, quietly and with precision, that that was a useful reframing. These were the kinds of conversations they had, useful, specific, real. He found, over the 5 weeks, that useful and specific and real were the register he had been looking for in this posting, and had not expected to find at an observatory rail at the 3rd hour of the evening watch. He had also told her in the 3rd week about the star he had grown up watching from a hill behind his family's house, a reference point his grandmother had shown him, a 2nd-magnitude star that was one of the brighter fixed points in the Terran northern sky, visible from late autumn through early spring. He had described the hill, and the cold, and the particular silence of a night far from a city when the sky is not washed out by ambient light. She had listened carefully. She had asked what it was like, the sky from that hill. He had said it was wide. Not larger than this sky, objectively, but familiar in a way that made it feel wide rather than vast, the way familiar things feel manageable even when they're large. She had said she had not been to many places outside the Velnara system, that the nature of the position meant that she came to the position and most things came to her, which was efficient and was also, in a way that she did not dwell on, its own kind of limit. He had said that Terran Hill was not going anywhere. 7th magnitude was patient. 2nd magnitude was also patient. She had been quiet for a moment, and then said, with a precision that he had come to understand, meant the statement had been selected carefully from a set of options. I believe that is the first time anyone has described a visit to a location by describing the star that would be visible from it. It seemed relevant, he said. It did, she said, yes. He had filed that particular quiet in the same place he filed the 11 seconds at the window, and the spectral array scope, and the way she said yes when something had actually shifted rather than merely been acknowledged. The file was, at this point, substantial. The night it changed was not a night he had expected anything from. He had come later than usual. The treaty provision meeting had run past the 6th hour, which almost never happened. The provision being discussed was one he had flagged 3 weeks ago as potentially ambiguous in its current language, and the council had spent 2 hours discovering that he had been right and another hour deciding what to do about it. And he had spent that last hour not saying anything in the gallery, because it was not a moment that required him to say anything, and had gone home to his embassy quarters and tried to decompress the session notes into a format suitable for a morning briefing. He had sat with the notes for 20 minutes, produced a first draft, found it inadequate, and decided to take the chart materials to the observatory instead, because he did his best document work when his hands were doing something else, and he could let the structure emerge without forcing it. He had gone through the archway without checking the log. She was there. She was standing at the rail, but differently than she usually stood there. Not the looser posture she adopted when she had been there a while and had settled into the room, but the straighter posture of someone who had arrived not long ago and had not yet let the room do what it did. She was still in her council robes. She was not looking at Velsath Thuren. She was looking at the dome frame, the structural curve of the viewport, the pale stone bracing, the seam where the original construction had met a later repair. She looked like a person who had been looking at the same thing for some time without resolving it. He stopped in the archway. She turned. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't check the log. I'll—" "Stay," she said. It came out differently than it usually did, without the qualifier, without the "you may" asterisk, without the framing that made it an offer rather than a statement. She said it, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Please." He crossed the floor and came to the rail. He did not take his usual position, a careful distance to her left. He came to the rail and stood somewhat closer than that, not so close that it was a claim, but close enough that the distance was no longer performing neutrality. "Are you all right?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that he had time to think she might not answer. At this court, non-answers were a valid response and carried their own information, and he had learned not to push into them. "The court presented its succession recommendation today," she said. "Formally in writing with the appropriate seals and the council's signatures. It was a comprehensive document, 37 pages, appendices." She paused. "They have identified 4 candidates. The ranking criteria are thorough. The assessment methodology is well documented. The timetable accounts for the seasonal governance calendar and includes a reasonable transition period." He had been monitoring the succession provision discussions in the margin of the treaty work. They were a domestic governance matter the embassy was required to track for diplomatic implications, but was not directly involved in. He had known the formal presentation was coming. He had not known it had been made today. He said nothing. He let her continue or not continue as she decided. "They are not wrong," she said. "The succession question is a real question. 7 years is a long time for an unclarified succession line. The court's position is institutionally reasonable. The document represents months of careful work by people who are doing their jobs properly and have the governance interest of the Velnara polity at heart." She stopped. Her hands on the rail were very still. "And," he said, because there was an asterisk and asterisk clearly, and she was carrying it. "And I found it." She stopped again, which was unusual enough that he registered it specifically. The Queen in the council chamber did not stop in the middle of a sentence. She paused sometimes for emphasis, but not for the reason Brennan recognized in this pause. "Difficult," she said finally. "I found it difficult this evening in a way I did not anticipate and was not prepared for. And I came here because this is the room where I come when I need to be honest about something I am not yet ready to be honest about in any other room." He held the weight of that carefully. "Velnara bonding tradition," she said. "I know you have read the relevant sections." Yes, he had memorized them. The Velnara consort selection process was formal and methodical, and based in a concept his translation guide rendered as complementary governance alignment, but which the academic literature he had read, the non-official compact sources, the pre-consolidation scholarship, translated as something more like the specific person whose presence makes you more yourself rather than less. The formal process was reliable at identifying candidates who met governance criteria. It was notably less reliable, the academic sources suggested, at identifying the other thing. Veldath was— She did not finish the sentence immediately. She looked at the dome, at the star field, at the patient light at bearing 42. He was a good person. The bond was real. It was not what the advisors had optimized for, because that is not the kind of thing an advisor can optimize for, but it was genuine, and losing it was a breath. "It was 7 years ago. I am not in grief. I want to be precise about that. I am not telling you this from grief. I am telling you this because the document I read today treated something that cannot be optimized for as a governance problem with a governance solution. And that is not wrong as an institutional approach. But I sat with the document for 2 hours this evening, and I kept returning to the same thought." "Which thought?" he asked. She looked at him. The green gold of her eyes in the observatory light was not the council chamber look. It was the look she had at the rail, the one he had been cataloging for 5 weeks. The one he was naming now, precisely, as the look of a person who was deciding to be seen. "It's been years since I had a mate," she said. The words arrived with a weight he recognized, not because they were dramatic. She had not said them dramatically. She had said them with the same precision she applied to everything, but because they were true in the way that things are true when they have been held for a long time without being said. The weight was the weight of the silence that had been keeping them. He could feel the shape of that silence in the room, the specific heaviness of something that had needed to be said and had finally been said, and the room felt different with it said than it had with it unsaid. He did not respond immediately. He looked at Velsath Thuren at bearing 42, 7th magnitude, holding position exactly where it had always been. He thought about what she needed him to say, and what he wanted to say, and whether those were the same thing, and found that they were. "I know," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her because he had been looking at her since she started talking, the way he looked at everything that mattered with real attention, the kind that does not announce itself. "You know," she said. "I've been watching you for 6 months," he said. "Not in a manner that required anything from you, and not in a way that was building toward anything. I was watching the way you watch something you want to understand, because I find that I am not capable of being in a room with something important and failing to pay attention to it. And one of the things that became clear to me over the course of that watching was that you were carrying something. That the person who was at this rail in the evenings was carrying something that the queen in the council chamber had learned to set down before she walked into any formal space. I didn't know what it was. I was not going to presume." Her hands on the rail were still. "And now you know," she said. "You told me." "Yes, a breath, I did." He held the moment carefully. He was a Terran cultural attaché at a Velnara royal court, and she was the queen of that court, and he had a list, internal, of the complications this moment entailed. A list he had been keeping for some time in the back of the part of his mind that tracked things he was not yet deciding anything about. The list was real, and the complications were real, and he was entirely aware of them. And then he said the true thing, because she had been honest with him, and he was going to be honest back. 6 months ago in the first Trade Commission session, I was in the 4th chair, 2nd row, he said. You asked Lord Orath a question about the mineral rights provision. 1 question, 4 sentences very precisely constructed. And Lord Orath, who I had been briefed was the most structurally resistant member of the commission, revised his position within the hour. And I sat in the gallery and thought very quietly to myself, with no claim attached to it, that I had not encountered someone whose mind worked quite like that before. Not the way I'd been told it worked. The way it actually worked. She said nothing, she listened. And then the session ended and you walked out of the council chamber, and in the corridor between that room and the next one there was a window, the long window on the east side, the one that looks out at the lower courtyard. You stopped at it for 11 seconds. You looked out at the courtyard, and then you put the queen back on and walked into the next room. He paused. I counted the 11 seconds because I was already paying attention by then. I wasn't doing it deliberately. I was just paying attention, and the 11 seconds were what happened. 11 seconds, she said. 11. The observatory was very quiet. The dome above them filtered the star field into something steady and unhurried, and the patient light at bearing 42 did what it had always done. The court's document, she said after a while, lists 4 candidates. Yes. None of them are Terran nationals. No, he said very carefully. I would imagine not. The compact has no established precedent for a Velnara royal bonding with a Terran national. There are 17 treaty provisions that would require review. The court would require an extraordinary session. Ambassador Dren would need to be formally notified through official channels and would need to respond within the notification window, which would take 3 weeks, he said, if the embassy responded at the earliest possible point within protocol. Which it would. This would be a Class 1 notification. Response within the first window is mandatory. 3 weeks, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the star field, not at him, not yet, the way you look at something else when you are deciding whether to look directly at the thing you are actually thinking about. I am not asking you for a governance solution, she said. I want to be precise about that. I am not presenting you with a succession problem and asking you to solve it. That is not what I said. I know, he said. What I am saying, she paused, and this pause was different from the earlier one. This pause was selection, the specific careful selection of someone who does not want to say the wrong true thing when the right true thing is available. What I am saying is that I have been in this observatory 3 and 4 times a week for 5 weeks, and I have been here because this is the room where I come when I need to be honest about something. And I found, over those 5 weeks, that when I was here, I was also here with you. And the honest thing, the thing I came here this evening to be honest about, is that I have spent 7 years carrying the weight of a court that requires me to be the solution to every problem it identifies. And in 7 years, this observatory has been the room where I did not have to do that. And in 5 weeks, this observatory has also been the room where you are. She finally looked at him. I did not anticipate that those two things would become the same thing. I have found that they have. He understood what she was saying. He understood it exactly because he had spent 6 months learning this particular court and this particular queen, and because the thing she was saying was not complicated at all once she had said it. It was very simple. It had been, he was fairly certain, very simple for some time, on both sides of the rail. I noticed the window, he said. Yes, she said, you did. They stood at the rail for a long time after that. Not in silence. There was too much to say for silence, now that the thing had been said and the room had room for it. He told her that the chart corrections she had given him in the first week he had incorporated into the official embassy survey atlas with attribution. She said she had found the notation 3 weeks later and had not mentioned it. He asked why. She said she had been deciding what to think about it. And he said, and I decided I approved, she said, and it was not an expansive answer. But he had learned over 5 weeks that expansive was not her register. Precision was, and I approved from her carried the specific weight of something given after consideration rather than reflexively. He told her about the provision ambiguity he had caught in the 4th review pass, the translation gap in the standard guide, the recommendation he had filed with Ambassador Dren. She told him the compact's own resources had the same gap, and it had not been addressed despite a review notice 2 years ago. He said he would include that in the recommendation, because a compact-level documentation issue made the embassy's gap look like a symptom rather than an oversight, which was a more accurate characterization, and also a more actionable framing for the people who would need to address it. She said, after a pause, that she had wondered whether the embassy's team would catch the gap. He said he tended to do a 4th review pass on anything that touched provisions with long-term implications, because the difference between a correct reading and a slightly incorrect one compounded across time. She was quiet for a moment. That is not standard attaché practice, she said. No, he said. It isn't. They were quiet for a while, and it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that did not require filling. He told her that he had a morning briefing to prepare for Ambassador Dren, that the briefing was going to require careful phrasing in several places, and that Dren had a tendency to respond to ambiguous phrasing by scheduling additional clarification meetings. She said she had a second-hour session with Lord Orath about the revised mineral rights language, and that Lord Orath would arrive with 17 additional objections prepared overnight, because Lord Orath always did. She would need to have identified the 3 substantive ones before he finished introducing all 17. Which 3? He asked. He had been in the gallery for every commission session. He had Lord Orath's pattern reasonably well mapped. She named the 3 she had identified. He agreed with 2 of them immediately and offered a different angle on the 3rd. The provision language had a clause that, read in the context of the revised mineral rights framework rather than the original, carried an implication she might not have flagged yet. He explained the implication. She listened with the complete quality of attention she brought to things she was genuinely processing rather than performing the processing of. Yes, she said when he finished. It was the specific asterisk yes, the one that meant her position had actually moved, not the one that meant she had acknowledged what he said. That clause. I read it 3 times and something was wrong with it and I could not identify what. That is the thing. I can pull the full provision language tonight, he said. I have treaty archive access if you want to review it before the session. She was quiet, then. That is not typically within an attaché's scope of service. No, he said, typically not. Another quiet, and then something shifted in the quality of the room, not heavier, lighter, like a thing that had been weighing down a column being acknowledged rather than avoided. The provision language is in Archive subsection 4, she said. The relevant clause sets are under the Restricted Mineral Rights Index, if you encounter the seal access barrier. I have clearance to subsection 4, he said. The ambassador upgraded it in the 3rd month. She looked at him. Of course he did. I asked for it, he said, politely with documentation. "Of course you did," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in the precise way it had moved on the first night. But this time he could read it fully, not an acknowledgement of navigated syntax, but something warmer, something directed at him specifically, something that did not need to be named to be understood. He pulled the provision language that night and sent it to her tablet through the palace internal network with a note flagging the 3 clauses most relevant to the angle he had identified, with a brief annotation on the implication chain for each one. She sent back a single line, Velsath Thuren, bearing 42. Holds position. He read it 3 times. He put his tablet down and went back to the briefing document and worked through the difficult sections with a precision he was aware was unusual even for him. The morning was complicated in the ways he had anticipated, and one way he hadn't. Ambassador Dren was a methodical reader. He read the report all the way through before asking any questions, which was his habit, and then he set it down and asked 3 questions. 2 were logistical. The third was the one Brennan had known was coming since he wrote the 4th paragraph. "The observatory," Dren said. "Yes," Brennan said. Dren read the paragraph again. He set the report down. "The scheduling log," he said. "Is accurate," Brennan said. "Neither of us has logged the visits. We have been present in the observatory at the same time on a number of occasions over the past 5 weeks. The visits have been," he chose the word, "significant." Dren was quiet for a moment that Brennan had learned to recognize, as the moment when Dren was organizing several things, simultaneously rather than proceeding sequentially. "The treaty provisions," Dren said. 17 requiring review, primarily. I've flagged the most directly relevant ones in the appendix, with an initial analysis of the review pathway for each. The 3 most significant are the provision language, the succession priority structure, and the import schedule. I've provided a suggested sequencing for the review process that front-loads the 2 with longer procedural timelines. Dren looked at the appendix. He read the flagged sections. He read the sequencing recommendation. He set the report down. "You have been at this posting for 6 months and 11 days, he said. "Yes. The mineral rights session is at the 2nd hour. "I know. I prepared background on Lord Orath's likely 3rd objection last night. It's attached. The issue is a clause in the revised provision language that carries an implication in the context of the current framework that wasn't present in the original. The Queen identified it as the most substantive of the 3. I provided the full provision text with annotations." Dren picked up the report again and located the attached analysis. He read it. He set the report down a 3rd time. "She said this to you directly," he said. "In the observatory." "Yes. And you said?" "I told her what I had observed, 6 months of observation. I was not making commitments or representations that exceeded my authority or scope. I was honest. She had been honest. I returned it." Dren looked at him over the report for a long moment. "The Velnara court," he said, "is going to have a substantial number of opinions." "Yes." "Lord Orath alone." 17 at minimum. "At minimum," Dren was quiet. Then, "the 3 substantive ones are the provision language, the succession priority structure, and the import schedule." Brennan looked at him. "I had a conversation with Councillor Velteth at the 6th hour this morning," Dren said mildly. "She is a pragmatic person. She observed that the pathway, while unprecedented in the compact record, is not prohibited by any existing provision in the current treaty framework, and that the court's objections would be procedural in nature if the foundational question had been answered, because procedural objections resolved through process and structural objections are considerably more difficult." "The foundational question," Brennan said. "Being," Dren said, "whether this is a governance solution or whether it is something else entirely." He was quiet. "She told Councillor Velteth it was not a governance solution," he said. "She was precise about that." "I know," Dren said. "Velteth told me what was said and how it was said, and Velteth is a precise person who uses words carefully. The distinction matters, and it was made." He paused. "She also told me that the Queen does not tell Velteth things she is not prepared to have managed. She told Velteth this." Another pause. "I think you should probably think carefully about what that means." Brennan thought carefully about what that meant. It meant the same thing as bearing 42, 7th magnitude, steady against the drift. Something that had been true for some time, holding position, waiting to be located by someone who knew where to look. The mineral rights session, he said. Lord Orath's third objection, the clause implication. I should brief you before the second hour. Yes, Dren said, you should. He organized the report back into order. Then, with the particular precision of an ambassador who had navigated difficult postings for 30 years and knew when a thing had been sufficiently discussed. And after the session, I think you know where you need to be. He was at the rail at the third hour, the afternoon session which he had not previously used. The dome was different in the afternoon light. The star field was not visible through the filtering system, which shifted the ambient output to a deep amber gold, warm and enclosed, the room feeling less like an observatory in the technical sense and more like a place where someone kept things they cared about. She arrived 23 minutes after he did. She came through the archway and found him at the rail and stood for a moment, registering the occupancy the way she always did, precisely, noting it without making anything of it in that first moment. Lord Orath, he said. Managed, she said, crossing to the rail. The third objection was provision language. Your angle was correct. It was the clause implication I had not fully resolved, and having the annotation clarified it sufficiently that I could address it directly rather than deferring. He revised his position at the halfway point of the session. She paused. He does not know the analysis came from you. It shouldn't matter where it came from. No, she said. But it will be useful to know, going forward, that when I encounter a provision problem I cannot resolve cleanly, asking you to look at it is likely to be productive. She turned to face him. You briefed Ambassador Dren. Yes. Velteth spoke with him at the 6th hour. He told me. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dome the way she had looked at it the night before, the structure of it, the frame, the steady architecture. Not avoiding looking at him, taking a moment to gather something before she looked directly. The court is going to have opinions, she said. Yes, he said. Lord Orath alone. 17 at minimum. Something moved in her voice, not quite the corner of the mouth movement, but the vocal equivalent, the slight warming that he had learned to read as the thing she had instead of lightness, which was not lightness but was its own kind of warmth. The provision language, the succession priority structure, and the import schedule are the three substantive ones. The others are procedural. Procedural resolves through process. I've read the pathway analysis, he said. It's in the appendix. The sequencing matters, the provisions with longer procedural timelines need to open first. I know, she said. I read the appendix. She turned fully toward him. You wrote the appendix at the 7th hour of the evening and sent it with an annotation note. I had archive access, and I was working anyway. Yes, she looked at him. The green gold of her eyes in the afternoon amber was the direct look, the one from the rail, the one that was seeing rather than assessing. Counselor Velteth told me this morning that the pathway was unprecedented but not prohibited, and that the foundational question was the relevant one, and once it was answered, the procedural objections would resolve through process. A pause. She was suggesting I answer it. And did you? I told her it was not a governance solution, she said. Which is the answer if you know how to read it? I know how to read it, he said. Yes, she said. I know you do. She turned back to the dome, to the amber gold light holding steady over the curve of the viewport. What I said last night, I said it because it was true, and because this room is the room where I come to say true things. I was not saying it as a governance problem I was expecting you to solve. I was saying it because you have been in this room with me for 5 weeks, and in that time you have been, she chose. The person I can say the true things to, I have not had that for a long time. I had not expected to find it here in this form. I found it, and I named it, and I would like to be clear that I do not regret naming it. He stood at the rail and looked at her. She was waiting, in the particular way she waited when she had made a precise statement, and was giving the other person the appropriate time to respond precisely rather than reflexively. I have been at this posting for 6 months and 11 days, he said. In that time I have written 43 briefing reports, attended 61 formal sessions, and spent approximately 9 hours at this rail. The 43 reports are thorough. The 61 sessions are in the official record. The 9 hours at this rail are the most, he found the word. True, he said. The most true time I have had at this posting, not because they were strategically significant, though some of what we discussed was. but because I was not managing anything in those hours. I was just here, with you. In the one room where you were also just here, and not the queen, or not only the queen. And I find that is rare. I do not take it lightly. She was still for a moment. Rare, she said. Rare, he said, and valued specifically. The amber gold held steady over the dome. Somewhere below them in the palace, 17 provisions were being managed, and Councillor Velteth was being pragmatic, and Lord Orath was revising his position, and Ambassador Dren was sequencing the review process in the order that front-loaded the items with longer procedural timelines. There will be an extraordinary session, she said. Yes. The 3 substantive objections will need to be addressed in the correct order. I know the order, he said. I wrote it. Yes, the corner of her mouth moved, the full version, warm and directed and not requiring any further interpretation. You did. They stood at the rail as the amber gold light held steady over the dome, and it was not the distance of the first night, and it was not the careful not claiming distance of the weeks that followed. It was the distance of 2 people who had found Velsath Thuren at bearing 42 and identified it, and had stopped pretending they hadn't. He found, standing there, that he had not expected this posting to be what it had turned out to be. He had expected competence and useful outputs, and the particular satisfaction of work done well in a complicated place. He had found those things. He had also found an observatory, and 11 seconds at a window, and a queen who maintained a spectral array scope, because she was not the kind of person who let something she cared about fall into disrepair for insufficient attention, and who came to this room when she needed to say true things and had said one to him. The evening session, he said, 3rd hour. I will be here, she said. I know, he said, so will I. She turned back to the dome, to the amber gold light, to the frame and the curve, to the place where Velsath Thuren would be visible in 4 hours at bearing 42, 7th magnitude, exactly where it had always been. She was not at a distance from him that required anything. He was not either. Outside the dome, the Velnara court was in motion, procedural, managed, working through the 17 in the correct order. Inside the observatory, the light held steady, and the room was exactly what it was. The room where she came to say true things, and the room where, for 5 weeks and now a little longer, he had been.